Hello and welcome to Looking Through Luke, a YouTube series where we systematically work through one of the ancient biographies of Jesus known as the Gospel of Luke. My name is James and I'm so glad that you've found us. Whether you're a skeptic, a curious onlooker, or indeed a follower of Jesus, my hope is that together we would have a clearer view of who Jesus is, the claims that he made and what he did, and that along the way we might even meet Jesus himself. Feel free to ask questions or comment below as we learn together. I'm so glad that you're here, so let's jump into our next episode. Welcome to Looking Through Luke. Thanks for joining us this week as we pick up our exploration through the biography of Jesus written by Luke for Theophilus and for anyone who might pick it up and read it. Each week we work through a little section in Luke's biography, his account of Jesus' life and ministry. And today we are looking at the birth of John. And this actually takes us back a few weeks to when the angel Gabriel appeared to Zechariah whilst he was in the temple serving God with the message that his wife Elizabeth was going to fall pregnant, though she was old in age and had been barren, and that they were going to have a son whose name would be John. And so today, Luke wants to convey early on in his biography to his readers, to Theophilus, that God does indeed do what he says. That's the big idea today. God does what he says. When we think about our own lives and our friendships and those around us, we want people in our lives that we can rely on, people who do what they say. One of my great struggles in life has been at times to follow through with the things that I've said. I always want to say yes to people, I always want to help, and someone will say, "Can you do this for me?" And my instinct is, yes, absolutely. And then minutes, hours, days, sometimes even weeks go by, and that thing doesn't eventuate. It happens with surprising frequency. Just ask my wife. She mentioned the other day, would I mow the lawn? And as I drove out of the driveway this morning, I couldn't help but notice the grass is a little higher. I say things, but I don't always follow through and do them. I've got another friend who I discovered his nickname is Gunner. And the reason his nickname is Gunner is because he's always going to do something. Oh, yeah, he's going to do this, and he's going to do that, and he's going to do something else, and he never actually gets to do it. So I'm pleased to know I'm not the only person in the world that suffers from this problem. In Australia at the moment, we're coming up to a federal election. And it's fascinating, isn't it, to watch politicians speak at one another, speak to the public, talk about what they're going to do. And they give their election promises, and we want to believe them, but deep down we know so much of what's said is hot air, so much of what's said won't eventuate, so much of what's said might even be called lies. Well-intentioned lies, perhaps, or little white lies. But we know that when our politicians say something, that they're going to do something, or they're going to promise something, that is by no means a guarantee it's going to happen. Well, Luke wants us to know that when God says something, he does it. Always. He follows through. If God says it, he'll do it. That settles it. Let me read from chapter 1, verse 57. It's the birth of John the Baptist. When it was time for Elizabeth to have her baby, she gave birth to a son. Her neighbours and relatives heard that the Lord had shown her great mercy, and they shared her joy. On the 8th day, they came to circumcise the child, and they were going to name him after his father Zechariah. But his mother spoke up and said, "No, he is to be called John." They said to her, "There's no one among your relatives who has that name." Then they made signs to his father to find out what he would like to name the child. He asked for a writing tablet, and to everyone's astonishment, he wrote, "His name is John." Immediately his mouth was opened and his tongue set free, and he began to speak, praising God. All the neighbours were filled with awe, and throughout the hill country of Judea, people were talking about all these things. Everyone who heard this wondered about it, asking, "What then is this child going to be?" For the Lord's hand was with him. So in verse 57, we read that Elizabeth gave birth to a son. Now that takes us right back to verse 13 in chapter 1, where the angel appears to Zechariah, the angel Gabriel, and says, "Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son." Now, further on, Luke reminds us, he brings us back to that moment where God said it through the angel. A long time ago, I used to dabble in stand-up comedy. I know it's hard to believe because I'm not funny, and that's why I don't do it anymore. It didn't last very long. But when you have a comedian who tells a joke early on in a set and then goes on and tells other jokes, sometimes they'll tell a joke and then they'll refer to an earlier joke they made. It's what's called a callback. Well, here, Luke gives us a callback. He writes that Elizabeth gave birth to a son, and it's a callback, a reminder to the readers, this is what God said would happen through Gabriel. Indeed it has. Then in verse 58, we read that her neighbours and relatives, her friends, those around her, shared with her in great joy. They shared her joy. And there we have another callback. Because in verse 14, Gabriel says to Zechariah, "He will be a joy and a delight to you, and many will rejoice because of his birth." And that's exactly what we see happening now. Many rejoicing because of the birth of this son. God has removed Elizabeth's barrenness. That's why the people are so happy, why they're rejoicing, why they're so full of joy. Of course, a baby in any age, a baby at any stage of life is a thing of great joy, new life being born, but particularly for Elizabeth. She's at an age where she shouldn't be able to have children. She's been barren her whole life. She lives in an age where to not have children is to be shamed and to not measure up, to not do what's expected of you as a wife and in that particular society. And God has not just removed her barrenness, He's removed her shame. She can hold her head up high. She can be free. And in removing her barrenness, we read, the Lord had shown her great mercy. It's a wonderful phrase. The Lord had shown her great mercy. And His great mercy is, in this case, His loving action. His mercy has been demonstrated through His loving action in causing her to conceive and gifting her, if you will, and Zechariah a son. Scrap that bit. Let me do it again. In removing her barrenness, we read, Luke says, the Lord had shown her great mercy. That's why the crowd are rejoicing. Her barrenness has been removed, and it's an act of God's mercy. And here, mercy is always the Lord's loving action towards someone, in this case, towards Elizabeth. Mercy has been a bit of a theme for Luke. In fact, in our previous looking through Luke, we unpacked some of Mary's song, the Magnificat, Mary's response to what God's doing in her life as she's pregnant with what will be the Messiah. She says, His mercy extends to those who fear Him. And now we see Elizabeth and Zechariah, people that fear God, love God, have sought to live in ways that please Him. He's extended His mercy towards them. He's shown his loving action intervening into their lives, and it's signified and symbolized with the birth of this boy. And then we get to verse 59. On the 8th day, they came to circumcise the child, and they were going to name him after his father Zechariah. Circumcision is not something that's so common in our day and age. If you don't know what it is, ask Dr. Google. I'm not going to explain it. But you should know that circumcision was a really important part of Jewish culture, not just because it was considered a good thing to do, but because it was actually a symbol, an outward physical symbol that was still hidden through clothes and modesty, that you belonged to God, that you were one of God's people. It was, in the Old Testament, it was known as a sign of the covenant, the promise, if you will, that God had made with the people Israel, that they were to be his people and he would be their God. And one of the ways that that was enacted was through circumcision. And circumcision, in this case, happened before a crowd of witnesses. By Zechariah and Elizabeth's day, usually that was a crowd of 10 was considered to be the witness to this circumcision. So you can imagine a little baby boy being circumcised with 10 of his nearest and dearest. Imagine growing up with those stories. Auntie Martha saying, "Oh, look, I remember when you were circumcised," and Uncle Ralph chipping in, going, "Oh, I remember too." And what a wonderful joy to grow up knowing that there'd be at least 10 people to remind you of that. It's one of God's great mercies. I think it happens at the 8th day, so there's no chance that you can remember it. But here what's interesting is that they go to circumcise John, and this is at the point where they give him his name. Up to this point, his son or baby or it or he, now they're going to name him. And it's a little unusual. Most Hebrew children were named immediately upon their birth. Like what we do today, if you give birth to a child, you've already got a name picked out, perhaps for a boy or a girl if you're not sure what sex the baby is. Pretty much that's how it was back then. You didn't have to think too hard about what you were going to name your child, because if it was a son, you were going to be named after your father, or perhaps your grandfather or another relative, but usually your father. So names were given at birth. Here we get to the 8th day, and John hasn't yet been named. He's still son. Although it's unusual, it's not unprecedented. In fact, it was typical for Greek children in ancient Greece not to be named until somewhere between the 7th and 10 days. So it's unusual, but on the 8th day, the baby's circumcised and they name him. And every expectation of all the witnesses is that the boy's name will be Zechariah. We even read in verse 59, they were going to name him after his father Zechariah. It's almost as if the crowd is going to name him. The parents don't need to do anything because we know his name is going to be Zechariah. But his mother speaks up and says, no, his name is to be John. And that throws the crowd for a bit of a loop. Hang on a second. Who are you? Mother? His name's going to be Zechariah. What do you mean it's going to be John? And of course, Elizabeth is acting in obedience to what she was told by the angel Gabriel. His name will be John. So they appeal to Zechariah and they signal to him and say, what's the baby's name going to be? And to their great astonishment, he writes out on a tablet, his name is John. Names matter. John actually means God is gracious. It's both a wonderful picture of God's gracious, loving kindness towards Zechariah and Elizabeth, that in their old age they give birth to a son, but it also is a signpost to what God will do. In this boy, we will see God's gracious action as he prepares the way for one who is to come. Names matter. These days, you hear all kinds of interesting and unusual names. Sometimes I feel like it's a bit of a contest amongst parents to work out who can pick the weirdest name or the most unusual name. We don't think about what that might mean for kids on the school playground, but we're going for it. But names are worth giving attention to. They're worth considering. I have two daughters, one whose name is Anna Laura, which means crowned with grace. Laura means crowned. Anna is a derivative, which comes from the word grace. And Janelle, my second daughter, means God is gracious. Again, Janelle is actually a derivative of the name Jane, which was a female equivalent to John. God is gracious. And so both our kids remind me of God's gracious activity towards us, towards me, in God's work in my life, but also in what God has done for me in Jesus. I don't always act graciously towards my kids either. Sometimes I forget that their names mean grace while I'm screaming at them, but in my better moments, I remember. Names matter. They give us a sense of who and what God is positioning and calling this baby, this child, to do and to be. It's a reflection, in this case, of God himself. His name will be John. And immediately we read, Zechariah, his tongue is loosed and he's able to speak. If you have just joined us, you may not realize that when the Gabriel appeared, the angel gave Zechariah this news in the temple that he was going to have a son whose name would be John. Zechariah didn't believe him, struggled to kind of process and wonder how this was going to happen. And Gabriel said, well, this is the sign. You're not going to be able to speak until the baby's born. And we have reason to believe that not only was he mute, he was also deaf as well. And here in this moment, as he writes out his name will be John, he can speak. Something's changed in Zechariah. He has learned through this pain and this period of silence and reflection to trust God even more than he already did. And at once his speech is returned and he begins to speak, praising God. And we read that all the neighbours were filled with awe and they began to talk about these two things. So with this miracle, there's two responses. Fear, people are in awe, they're afraid, there's this realization that God is near, that there's something supernatural going on, something beyond their comprehension. And they begin to talk about it. You can imagine, you're seeing something miraculous, you can't stop talking about it, discussing about it. What does it mean? Something different's happening. What's going on? And they're left with a question on their hearts. And in verse 66, it says, everyone who heard this, that's heard Zechariah and witnessed what had happened, wondered about it, asking, what then is this child going to be? And that word wondered actually is a phrase which means to set in the heart. It made an impression. It was unforgettable. And they went away with this question, what is God doing? What is this child going to be? What's happening? Well, as we draw our time together to a close today, I want to bring it back around to that idea at the start that what God has promised, he will do. And that's what Luke wants us to see. And that leaves us with a question. If you've never read the biography of Jesus, the Gospel according to Luke, it leaves us with the question, well, if God says, it leaves us with the question, if God will do what he has said, what is God going to do? What's still yet to come? There's a mystery here. And we're going to see it and unpack it. And we're going to be faced with things that on the surface might appear to be unbelievable, beyond our comprehension. But as we look at the lives of people like Elizabeth and Zechariah and their experiences, we begin to see, and we can therefore begin to trust, that if there is a God, and if he is who he says he is, then he's the kind of God who does what he says he will do. That means he's a God that can be depended on. That means he's a God who can be trusted. And if you know the story, if you know what happens, then you can rejoice with Elizabeth and Zechariah at God's faithfulness, but it also gives you hope. Maybe you're going through a season or period of pain or silence or reflection where things haven't worked out yet, or where there's a sense of things still being unfulfilled. God will do what he says. He is faithful. His promises are yes and amen, and he can be trusted. So hang in there. Maybe there's still questions that are left unanswered, but I hope and pray as we keep looking through Luke, we're going to uncover more of who this God is, and we're going to see in Jesus not only that does God do what he says, but the incredible implications, the incredible promises that are true for us who believe now because of his loving kindness, because of his mercy, his love in action. So thanks for being with me. Can't wait to see you next time. Take care. Thanks so much for watching. Feel free to make a comment below. And if you did find the video helpful or interesting, please hit the thumbs up and give us a like, and click the bell notification and subscribe. It really helps us get these videos out to a wider audience. We're not trying to build a massive following or channel. We are simply trying to communicate the truth of who Jesus is from the Bible. So if that's something that you can get behind, we'd love your support by doing those two simple things. It really helps us out. Thank you, and see you next time.